All right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and share my screen and we're going to get back to it. All right, so we're going to go ahead and talk about sex education. So we, as the US, were the world leader in sex education and comprehensive sex education until the 1950s. During the McCarthy era, there was a very big conservative push to remove the comprehensive sex education and move back towards abstinence only. So there's so much variance at this point because it's really a state by state, really a district by district decision on when sex education starts, how much of it actually happens, what it's about, what it entails, what it doesn't entail, and what the consequences of all those things are. So when you have abstinence only education, really there's a push for no sex until you're married, blah, 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 blah. It's not realistic. It's not realistic at this point. And it never really has been realistic. And it leaves people open to many different safety risks when not knowing the risks of HIV, AIDS, not knowing the contraceptive options, not knowing how to physically and emotionally keep yourself safe in these situations. Comprehensive sex education, again, varies widely too. So you have some comprehensive sex education that does a good job about talking about STD prevention, that does a good job about talking about contraceptive use, does a good job about talking about oral and all the different kinds of sex that are possible. But it doesn't necessarily always include LGBTQ plus sex and or sex that isn't the normative heteronormative like structure. And in that can leave vulnerabilities for LGBTQ plus people to not have the same education that they need and the same understanding of how the encounters that they have might impact their health and well-being. In the 1980s, there's a policy shifts that really, again, what comprehensive sex was out there really got shifted and polarized once again. So in the 1950s and the 1980s, we saw a high amount of pushback to any kind of progressive policy. And so it's not surprising that sex education was part of that pushback. And that was really coming from the era in the 1960s and 1970s, where we had civil rights legislation and also activism. And we also had women's rights activism and we had LGBTQ plus activism. And so the 80s were really like this era where there was just societal pushback or like intentional control being put into place in order to kind of maintain these social norms and social hierarchies that activism was doing a very good job of kind of breaking down and trying to push away, or not away, but kind of make cracks into those social norms and kind of fill them with more accurate representation of history. Research results show that abstinence only education does not lower pregnancy or STD rates or rates of sex. So abstinence only education, the only real goal it does is make specific entities feel better about not explaining sex to youth. However, this has a lot of safety implications. In the probably late 90s, early 2000s, HIV/AIDS education became part of comprehensive sex education. And sometimes it was a different entity. So like in the early 2000s, I worked as an HIV/AIDS educator throughout high school and part of college with the Red Cross. And essentially I would go into middle schools and high schools and talk to the kids about HIV/AIDS prevention, what it was, what it wasn't, the risk levels, what things were risky, what things could prevent it. And there is nothing like getting over a fear of public speaking, like talking to, as a cis high school female, talking to an all boys rural Kentucky school on sex education. There's just not quite anything like that experience. And I don't think there's ever going to be an experience where at this point I could get embarrassed about the topic I'm talking about, just because that in and of itself was eye-opening and all fears of public speaking had to go away. people who back comprehensive sex education also really feel that knowledge is power, and it also equates to safety, right? So like the more you know and the more you talk about how to have safe sex, the more you talk about the ways in which you can protect yourself, the ways in which you can prevent STDs, the ways in which you can control family planning, the ways in which the rights in which you have, how to understand consent, all of these things are tied into safety mechanisms that allow the people participating in this to have a more pleasurable experience, to have a more powerful experience, and to have something that where you get to feel empowered in your own sexuality. 93% of our country support teaching comprehensive sex education. And that's just because I think at this point we understand that teenagers have sex, right? Like, I don't think that we're in a society where at this point we really are blind to that fact or even want to be nose blind to that fact. And I think that understanding that means understanding that the consequences of those things, especially watching the generation that's parenting now, having watched really the HIV/AIDS epidemic really show and flourish, really, I think, impacted how the country perceives teaching comprehensive sex education now. Now, despite the fact that 93% of the country support teaching that, that does not mean it's happening, right? It's consistently, there is most rural environments do not teach comprehensive sex education. In your incredibly red districts, you do not see comprehensive sex education. There's still some schools that don't have any sex education, abstinence only or nothing. Like, they just don't talk about it. The subject doesn't exist. And so that's really problematic for a number of reasons. And so also I want to make two clarifications. If we're going to do comprehensive sex education at this juncture, we need to start talking about how to involve LGBTQ plus visibility into those conversations. And we also need to talk about how to talk about the intersections and really talk about the stereotypes and kind of knock down some of those promiscuous stereotypes, knock down some of those double standards, and really talk about the ways in which intersectionality of gender, race, ability, and all of those things intersect with sexuality, so that we can have a more comprehensive understanding of our sexual well-being. And whether or not that will happen is kind of up in the air. We will see. It kind of depends on how the next couple political cycles work, whether or not we are going to revert for a while, and how much we're going to get that pushback from the early 2000s and the 2010s kind of activist movements. So we shall see. All right, and now we're going to go into college education. This is going to be, a pretty straightforward thing because we've talked about a lot of these things already. But how visible are your LGBTQ plus in your curriculum? How many LGBTQ plus leaders are or can be out as LGBTQ plus? Does your university celebrate Pride Week, and or do organizations have LGBTQ plus persons in them? Or the organizations themselves are LGBTQ plus. Geez, I don't know why that just slipped out of my face. And how does hookup culture impact university students, and really campus culture surveys? So this is kind of the thing we're going to talk about as we move through some of this. Being a faculty member that is LGBTQ plus and part of that community, that's the reason I use the word queer community so often, is because I'm a part of it. And that is a term that I specifically like to use for myself and the community, because to queer something is to change it, to break from the mold, to make it to queer. We need more queering. We don't need to have things that are all homogenous and all fitting a specific mold. I don't think humans fit that. And so understanding that we all kind of queer things in our own ways allows us that space to really engage in meaningful conversation and allow access to intersectional, like, we're all going to be not the mold in some way. So let's figure out how being not the mold impacts us, and let's figure out why these molds are put in place and figure out how to knock them down. So I use the word queer for the LGBTQ plus population because I still think it is one of the most marginalized populations in our country at this juncture. And I think that when you add that to the intersection of race, when you add that to the intersection of disability, I think that gets even worse. And I want to make sure that we are really having conversations that are meaningful. And I particularly and intentionally make myself known as LGBTQ plus because I think that that's part of the political action strategies that I have as a human being. But I understand that that also comes with consequences, and it does come with consequences. So as part of an educational leader, whether they can be out or not, this subject is personal to me, right? Like this subject does matter when we talk about college education, when we talk about visibility, when we talk about inclusion. These are things that I felt as a student. These are things that I continue to feel as faculty members, and it's things that we have to continue to talk about because we're not at the place in which inclusion is wholehearted and or structured into place. So let's go ahead and talk about visibility. And again, this is visibility not just within like the people, right? This is also within the curriculum, within what we're talking about. Are the concepts, are they looking through that intersectional lens? Are they looking through that lens of how does the LGBTQ plus population fit into this conversation? Visibility and leadership. I don't think we see that a whole lot yet in upper academics, not at least at our state schools. We might see that. I don't even think we see that in Ivy Leagues, to be honest. Do we see visibility in group memberships? Do we see visibility in spaces? How about in text or in literature, in policy? And again, there were 0 openly gay faculty members until 1970s. And this hits home for me because so my great aunt has had a partner she's lived with for an extended period of time. And it's interesting to me because they were both faculty members for a long time, worked in education. And they still are just roommate, like to my entire family, to most of the people they're around, they're roommates. And or partners, depending on the situation, depending on who it is they're around. And I think it's interesting to, again, note the difference that I get to experience as a faculty member that is allowed to be openly out and versus what her experience was as a faculty member who was never really openly out. Now, that doesn't mean that people did not know. It just means that they never got to be open. There was never like facilitation of how to be that person in that particular dynamic in a supported and inclusive way. So as we talk about inclusion in college situations, we're going to talk about trans inclusion because there is women's colleges and they currently, depending on the college, don't always accept trans women into those. There is less pushback for trans men in men's colleges, but again, on the fact that that person also can experience a lot of violence. And so there's less desire for that. That makes that less desirable in a lot of cases due to the gender dynamics that play out in men's colleges. LGBTQ plus friendly dorm groupings. So like when you know that you have LGBTQ plus individuals coming into the school, whether or not they get set up with roommates that are queer friendly, or whether they get set up with roommates that are going to make their college experience incredibly difficult and trying and sometimes even harmful or toxic. So you're also going to want gender inclusive housing. So that includes housing that will allow trans individuals to be in the housing situations that are inclusive to them. And so sometimes you have like non-gendered based dorm settings where they can be, where it's co-ed or what have you. So allowing that ability. So there's a pride index for schools across the country that rates on a 5-point scale, 5-star scale or whatever, how friendly you are to the LGBTQ plus population. EKU is at a 3.5 out of 5, which is considerably better than I thought it was going to be honest, but it is still having a lot of room for improvement. Allowing pronouns and name changes on school accounts. So things like your Blackboard page, things like that. And there seems to be a lot more push for that and a lot more desire to do that. You can do that here at EKU. So if you ever have questions on how to do that, or you have somebody that you know that needs to learn how to do that or wants to do that, please let me know and I can get you to the person or walk you through it if I can figure out how to do it, which I think I know how. There's sports inclusion for our trans and LGBTQ plus persons. There's also hiring more queer faculty and administrators, and then having more pride, like more bigger pride celebrations and more alliance groups. Curriculum, again, this is going to be where our histories, our biographies, our visibilities of more than just heteronormative stories, more than just heteronormative superheroes. You know, we talk about the superheroes of history. We also need to talk about the superheroes of history that do not fit the normative. And this goes for a lot of different intersections. That's not just talking about sexuality, but really talking about race and gender and age and other marginalized status, right? So immigrant status and all of these things. And really talking about the LGBTQ rights movement in the same way that we need to continue to talk about the civil rights movement and other movements that happened in our country. It's a vital part of our history, and it should be considered part of our history and taught in our history classes. And we need to focus on not just the trauma narrative. So when we talk about LGBTQ plus in the curriculum, we need to talk about them in a way that is transformative, that is talking about them in the context of their positive experiences, not just their negative ones. And then when we talk about hookup culture, right? So when we talk about colleges, there isn't really much descriptions of college or media expressions of college that don't really talk about our hookup culture, right? So in the 1920s, college lives were very different. They were separated, but there was still a pretty liberated form of understanding that college was a time to sexually experiment. You could go across heteronormative lines to really experience things that weren't necessarily available in the culture more broadly. Now, again, this was depictive of mostly white academics because, again, this was the 1920s. And so that was prior to a lot of enrollment of Black university students. In the 1960s, there was a heavy crackdown on the ability to have more free love and enjoy those kind of college experiences as something that was kind of a cultural norm. But there was pushback. Obviously, you had the 1970s that came out of the pushback of cracking down on sexual expression and those kind of experiences. But also, like, up until probably 1970s or so, students were really considered minors that needed looked after by parents. Parents had a lot of say in, after that crackdown in the 1960s, had a lot of say about who they got to interact with, how they were going to interact. You had a lot of people keeping an eye on you. You had a lot of supervision. There was a lot of not being allowed to do things, not being considered an adult, really. And students kind of demanded their adulthood, right? Like, they protested, they actively changed things and how that culture was going to react. And what came out of it was really this kind of hookup culture. And it mostly predominantly happens in the early couple of years of college, where marriage is really not happening till later in their life. They're not really looking for that. So they're not being tied. They don't want to be tied down in the earlier years of college. But they do want to have those experiences and those interactions with other individuals. The problem here is that men can hold a lot of power in these dynamics because there is still a social stigma attached to virginity, attached to purity, attached to female withholding sexuality, kind of, to an extent. And whereas men have more social status tied into sexual conquest or sexual expedition. And part of that ends up being that women end up with this kind of double standard that they're not supposed to engage in these activities, but men are supposed to engage in the activities with women somehow without them being engaged with. It's a very interesting dynamic if you really think about it. But the power that gets put in these positions is that these women end up having to be more secretive about how much they're engaging in this, and or deal with the social sanctions that come with outwardly expressing their sexuality, along with falling outside of the hetero norm comes with its own social sanctions within these kind of structures. There's also, we can talk about the orgasm gap, which really falls down to, there's a lot of in young sex, well, really in sex overall, there's a lot more favorable conditions for men to have orgasms. And that seems to be more culturally sound and more of the messaging that gets sent than the female orgasm. And so that tends to be a very big gap that comes with social interactions and sexual interactions, especially in the youth, especially in anyone under the age of like 20s, 30s, late 20s, 30s. Also, women generally hit their sexual prime at a later point in their life because they're allowed to socially at a later point in their life, right? So that's tied again to that youth should be pure, should be virgin status. That's all of that mess is tied into this idea that then women can be sexually explorative once they find their partner or once whatever happens, or they get a little older into their late 20s, early 30s. So real quick, we're gonna work through work because this is a lot of this stuff we've kind of touched base on in other lectures, and I want to kind of power through this. So hetero privileges in the workplace include that parental privileges for men. So when men become fathers, they tend to get pay raises. They tend to be considered more loyal employees because they have a reason to stay there now because they are supporting a family or what have you. There's those assumptions. There is a lot of places where being a heteronormative parent is very easy to be visible. It's something that's part of, it's considered socially normal. So it's something that's allowed to be there. For the mother, it tends to have much more of a negative impact in the sense of they're considered now caregivers of other people. So there's a understanding that won't be as dedicated to work or what have you, or will have to split time and things of that nature. Heteronormative couples don't have to fear not being hired or not being promoted or not being fired because of someone finds out what their sexuality is or who they love. And they get to be more out and be more visible at social functions like job picnics or like having your spouse come for lunch or something to that nature. Like they get to be more out and visible with those things. And there's a lot of discrimination during pregnancy and after you have a baby. So just recently, there were laws put into place that allow you the time to pump if you would like to pump, but that wasn't always the case. They have to hold your job, I think, for 3 months, but you do not get paid maternity leave in a lot of places. I don't think they have to hold your job if you're a part-time employee. So there's a lot of like leeway and a lot of leeway to discriminate against pregnant individuals. Sexual harassment is flourishing in workplace environments. Homophobia is also flourishing in workplace environments. Coming out at work becomes a really big challenge depending on where you work, what the dynamic is, what the job is, how much you engage with other people, what kind of people you're engaging with. And again, that could be a process. It could be something that you do with not as many people. It can be something that you do with most of the people. It could be something that you're out and proud about. It just kind of depends on the dynamic. It depends on the person, and it depends on the other coworkers. Businesses and Pride Month marketing. So like every June, you can see like Pride everywhere, right? Like it's in your top shoe brands come out with their shoes. You get your rainbow Chucks out, you get your rainbow Adidas out, you get your Target's full of rainbow everything. You got Walmart gets its Pride flags out, gets this rainbow gear out, right? Like, and that's because there's a way in which they commercialize the sexuality and commercialize that particular thing. So within workplaces, it might be a viable sales pitch, but it's not always necessarily reflective of the company's policies towards LGBTQ members. Sexual harassment, disproportionately, it is women that are sexually harassed in the workplace. Male-dominated work environments make it worse. So if you have any kind of hard labor, any kind of construction, any kind of those kind of dynamics, you're going to see a lot more sexual harassment. Decreased productivity. For the women, it creates decreased productivity, depression, and increased stress. This can lead to leaving the work. It can lead to less promotions. It can lead to a lot of economics impacts as well. there's a job gender context. So, right, like, so there is a consistent line within the hierarchy where men consistently make more. Now that when it gets more complicated, when you add in the intersection of race, when you add in the intersection of age, when you add in the intersection of educational opportunities. And so there's a lot of different contexts there, but there is clearly a gender differential and organizational tolerance. So like whether or not your organization has a climate that's conducive for sexual harassment or it puts a stop to it really has to do with leadership. It really has to do with policies, because everything comes down from the top. Like, so if you have a boss at the top that's sexually harassing people, the likelihood that sexual harassment is going to be taken seriously in that office is not high, right? If you have a good working environment where there's a decent amount of women at the top, there's a decent amount of diversity, and they have real frank conversations about how they want their organizational climate to be, you're more likely to have inclusive spaces. All right. So homophobia can take place in many different ways. In a lot of ways, it lacks workplace protections. It can be very tokenizing in the sense that, hey, this is our token queer person, essentially, like we've filled our quota, and there's a lot of jokes and there's a lot of like stereotyping done to these people that fulfill that role. Implementation of policies. Okay, so there's a lot of privileging the nuclear family. So like that comes down to things like how we organize our benefits packages, how you organize your structured days off, or your maternal or paternal leave. If you don't have paternal leave, but you have two men in a family that are adopting a baby, somebody's got to stay home with that baby, and they don't have the option to do so, which is incongruent with what we know about how a family member needs to bond with their new little ones. And permitting a climate stifles discussions of LGBT. There's a lot of stifling of conversations about LGBTQ plus relationships, because a lot of businesses are like, well, we don't have to deal with that. A person can do whatever they want on their own free time. But in stifling that conversation, you also stifle the ability to how that impacts their work environment, how that impacts the individuals as they go. There's a lot of worker stigmatization. So you're going to get a lot of that harassment and a lot of those jokes, a lot of those homophobic measures that get put in place. And it's whether or not you can tolerate it and to what extent. And there's not a lot of protections that allow you or allot you the positionality to be able to make a whole lot of change. A lot of that has to come at your own expense. It costs a lot of mental health and minority stress when it comes to those kind of populations. The hiring, firing, and promotional process a lot of times has to deal with the different marginalizations and identities that someone can have. And those, particularly in the LGBTQ plus population, experience a lot of discrimination when it comes to hiring and promotion, and firing, especially if one gets outed within a work environment and then gets fired. Again, we talked kind of about the stereotyping and the sexual harassment. And then of course there's gender discrimination within the workplace, which is a whole nother lecture in and of itself. So I'm not going to get into all of those things. And know that currently there is a lot of things in place now, the moving parts that are working through our court systems all the way up to our Supreme Court, which did rule that it is inappropriate for jobs to discriminate against LGBTQ plus people under the Title IX, which would fall under Title IX. However, that still is limited in some ways to federal funding and has other implications as well, and is always being challenged. So those laws will continue to get pushed back, and it will continue to be kind of part of the process. So that's kind of the end of that. Again, coming out at work is kind of similar to coming out at school, and we kind of moved through that already. So I'm going to go ahead and get off here. I hope you guys are having a wonderful module and a great week, and I will see you next time.